I suppose I should have known something was wrong the minute I turned onto Maple Street. Mrs. Henderson's tabby cat, the one that normally sprawled across my front porch like he owned the place, was conspicuously absent. The row of cars that should have lined my driveway for our annual Thanksgiving gathering were nowhere to be seen. Even the porch light I always left on when expecting visitors remained dark against the November twilight. Still, exhaustion from my 3-day meditation retreat had dulled my usual sharp instincts. When I'd reluctantly agreed to Sister Catherine's invitation to the silent retreat at St. Mary's Retreat Center, I'd made it clear to my son Robert that I'd be home by 4 o'clock on Thanksgiving Day. Plenty of time to finish preparations for the family dinner at 6. The house would be empty until then, he'd assured me, as everyone was arriving together from the airport. Perfect timing. Or so I'd thought. I pulled into my driveway at precisely 3:55 p.m., noting with satisfaction that punctuality remained one of my stronger virtues at 72. The quiet neighborhood, with its leaf-strewn lawns and smoke curling from chimneys, embodied everything I loved about New England in late autumn. I'd lived in this colonial house for 43 years, raised my son within its walls, and had never considered living anywhere else, despite Robert and Bethany's persistent suggestions that I downsize to something more manageable. As if the 4-bedroom home where I'd given piano lessons for 4 decades was suddenly beyond my capabilities just because I'd celebrated another birthday. I gathered my small overnight bag from the passenger seat and made my way up the familiar flagstone path, mentally reviewing the dinner preparations still needed. The turkey had been prepped and left ready for roasting. The cranberry sauce had been made 2 days prior. Pies, both pumpkin and pecan, waited in the freezer. All that remained was the final execution, which I had down to a precise choreography after decades of practice. My key turned smoothly in the lock, the familiar resistance just before the tumbler clicked, bringing an automatic smile to my face. Home. Despite the retreat's tranquility, there was nothing like returning to one's own space. "Hello?" I called out automatically as I stepped inside, though I expected no answer. The foyer was dark, but a faint light spilled from the living room. I frowned, certain I hadn't left any lamps on before departing. Setting down my bag, I reached for the wall switch. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," came a gravelly voice from the shadows of my living room. "These old eyes don't adjust to brightness like they used to." I froze, my heart launching into a staccato rhythm that would have impressed my most advanced piano students. There, barely visible in the dim glow of a single table lamp, sat a man in my favorite rocking chair, a spindly figure with a shock of white hair and gnarled hands folded neatly across a tartan blanket. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. "And what are you doing in my house?" The old man opened one rheumy blue eye, regarding me with surprising sharpness. "Arthur Caldwell, Bethany's stepfather. Well, her mother's husband. Stepfather implies I had some hand in raising her, which I most certainly did not." He closed the eye again. "As for what I'm doing here, I was rather hoping you might illuminate that particular mystery." I stood speechless, my mind scrambling to place the name. Arthur Caldwell. Yes, Bethany had mentioned him, her mother's second husband, a retired professor or performer of some kind. They'd met him at her mother's funeral last spring, the first time Bethany had seen him in person. A difficult man, she'd said, set in his ways, rather like looking in a mirror, I thought fleetingly. "Where is my family?" I asked, finally stepping fully into the living room. "Where's Robert? And Bethany? The children?" Arthur Caldwell sighed, a sound of infinite patience tested. "On the table beside you. The note explains everything, or nothing depending on your perspective." I turned to see a folded piece of paper propped against a vase of fresh chrysanthemums, flowers I certainly hadn't left there. With growing apprehension, I opened the note, immediately recognizing my son's rushed handwriting. "Mom, sorry for the last-minute change of plans. Bethany won a cruise package through her office. 4 days, all expenses paid, departing today. Too good an opportunity to pass up, but they only had 4 spots. Arthur needed somewhere to stay since his retirement community is being fumigated this week. Bedbugs, don't ask. 2 problems, 1 solution. You two will get along great, both stubborn as mules and full of stories. We'll be back Monday night for a belated Thanksgiving dinner. Love you, Robert. P.S. Arthur takes heart medication with dinner. Reminder on the fridge. Thanks, Mom. You're the best." I read the note twice, certain I had misunderstood. Then a third time, As the full implications sank in, they had left, all of them, on Thanksgiving, without warning, and they'd left me with a complete stranger. A stranger who apparently needed medication and supervision. "This can't be right," I said aloud, though to myself or to Arthur I wasn't sure. "There must be some mistake." "The only mistake," Arthur replied, finally opening both eyes, "was in their assumption that we would meekly accept this arrangement without complaint." Something in his tone, a blend of irritation and conspiracy, made me look at him more carefully. Arthur Caldwell was older than I'd initially thought, perhaps mid-80s, with a face that brought to mind a weathered map, all lines and history and unexplored territories. Despite his apparent frailty, his blue eyes sparked with an intelligence that belied his years. "Did you know about this plan?" I asked. A thin smile crossed his face. "Not until they deposited me here this morning with a suitcase and an apology so insincere it wouldn't convince a kindergartner." He adjusted his position in the rocking chair with a small grunt of discomfort. Apparently my presence would ruin the cruise experience for Bethany. Something about my tendency to speak unvarnished truth at inappropriate moments. Despite myself, I felt a reluctant smile tugging at my lips. And what unvarnished truth might that be? That Bethany's new haircut makes her look like she's auditioning for a community theater production of Annie Get Your Gun, perhaps, he offered. Or that those children of hers spend so much time staring at electronic devices they'll likely evolve without the need for neck mobility. A startled laugh escaped me before I could suppress it. Whatever I had expected from this interloper, it wasn't this acerbic candor. "So," Arthur said, leaning forward slightly, "they've abandoned us both for sun and cruise ship buffets. The question is, Margaret Walsh, what do you intend to do about it?" I stared at him, surprised he knew my name, though I shouldn't have been. "How do you know who I am? Besides the obvious context clues?" He raised one bushy eyebrow. "Your photographs are everywhere, and Bethany spent the car ride here explaining that you're particular and set in your ways, but that I shouldn't take it personally. Apparently, we're both difficult elderly relatives to be managed rather than people to be respected." The accuracy of his assessment stung. "Is that how my family saw me? A problem to be managed?" Arthur's gaze softened fractionally. "I've upset you. Not my intention, though honesty is a habit I've found too rewarding to break at this late stage." I drew myself up, professional dignity reasserting itself after decades of teaching unruly piano students. "You haven't upset me, Mr. Caldwell. You've merely confirmed suspicions I've harbored for some time." He nodded, a gesture of unexpected solidarity. "Then perhaps we understand each other better than our children anticipated." He leaned forward, those startling blue eyes suddenly animated with mischief. "Podemos começar?" "I beg your pardon?" "It's Portuguese. Shall we begin?" "I spent a sabbatical year in Lisbon in my younger days." He waved a dismissive hand. "The question stands, regardless of language. They've played us for fools, Margaret. Shall we begin our response?" I should have been outraged, should have called Robert immediately, demanded explanations and apologies, should have made arrangements to remove this stranger from my home. Instead, I found myself nodding slowly, a lifetime of restraint and accommodation giving way to something more primal and satisfying. "Yes," I said simply, "I believe we shall." The absurdity of my situation fully hit me as I stood in my kitchen, mechanically preparing tea while a strange octogenarian dozed in my living room. My carefully orchestrated Thanksgiving, the turkey that should now be roasting, the china that should be arranged on my dining table, the family that should be arriving any minute, all reduced to a hastily scrawled note and an unexpected houseguest. "Milk, no sugar," came Arthur's voice, startling me from my thoughts. He stood in the doorway, one hand gripping a polished wooden cane I hadn't noticed earlier. "If you're making Earl Grey, that is. Otherwise, plain is fine." "How did you know you were making tea?" He smiled slightly. "The kettle whistling was my first clue. The fact that you're British and it's precisely 4 o'clock provided additional evidence." I bristled. "I'm not British. I was born in Boston, but raised by British parents, unless I miss my guess. That posture didn't come from American public schools, and there's a hint of Sussex in your vowels when you're annoyed." He moved carefully to the kitchen table and lowered himself into a chair with practiced precision. "Which you currently are, though I can't determine if it's with me or the situation." "Both," I admitted, pouring hot water into my grandmother's teapot. The familiar ritual steadied my nerves. "How do you know I'm annoyed?" "Your left eyebrow lifts approximately 3 millimeters, and you press your lips together just enough to create a small line above your chin. He tapped his own chin in demonstration. 4 decades of directing community theater productions makes one observant of micro-expressions. Theater, I corrected automatically. You said theater with an ear ending. But if you spent time in England... Ah, so I was right about the British connection. His eyes twinkled with satisfaction. One adapts to local pronunciation after 50 years in American academia, but you're correct. It should be theater. Old habits are easily buried, but never truly die. I brought the tea tray to the table, irrationally grateful that I'd restocked my pantry before the retreat. At least we wouldn't starve while sorting out this mess. Though the feast I'd planned, with Robert's favorite cornbread stuffing and Bethany's marshmallow-topped sweet potatoes, and the twins' expected demands for extra cranberry sauce, that careful calibration of family preferences developed over years of holiday meals. You're catastrophizing, Arthur observed mildly, accepting the teacup I offered. I recognize the expression. My late wife wore it whenever our plans were disrupted. I am not catastrophizing, I replied stiffly. I am justifiably upset that my family has abandoned me on a major holiday with a complete stranger while they gallivant on a cruise ship. A stranger who requires medication, no less, he added helpfully. Don't forget that particular imposition. Despite myself, I felt a reluctant smile tug at my lips. Yes, thank you for the reminder. You're welcome. He sipped his tea with surprising delicacy for hands so gnarled with arthritis. Excellent brew. Ceylon, with a hint of bergamot? I nodded, momentarily disarmed by his accuracy. My father's preferred blend. I order it from a specialty shop in London. Stanley's on Portobello Road? They supplied the faculty lounge at Oxford during my visiting professorship in '82. For a moment I saw him differently. Not as an imposition or a problem to be managed, but as a person with a history as rich and complex as my own. It was an uncomfortable realization that I had initially viewed him with the same dismissive lens I resented in my own family. Now that we've established my tea preferences and your British heritage, Arthur continued, perhaps we should address the proverbial elephant in the room. What exactly shall we do about our inconsiderate children? I set my cup down with a decisive click. First, I'm calling Robert. This is completely unacceptable. Arthur's expression turned shrewd. Before you do, consider this. They're likely already at sea, conveniently beyond reliable phone reception. A quick check of my cell phone confirmed his suspicion. A text had arrived while I was unpacking. Boarding now. Signal spotty on ship. We'll check in when we can. Arthur likes PBS and classical music. You'll get along great. Unbelievable, I muttered. They've planned this escape thoroughly. Indeed. Arthur leaned back, studying me with those penetrating blue eyes. Tell me, Margaret, have they been pushing you to downsize recently? Perhaps suggesting retirement communities or condominiums with amenities for active seniors? The question struck uncomfortably close to home. How did you know? Because Bethany has been sending me brochures for Sunset Palms Retirement Village for 6 months, he replied dryly, after spending precisely 3 hours with me at her mother's funeral. Apparently, I made quite an impression. And now they've thrown us together. I trailed off as a new, unsettling thought emerged. Wait, you don't think... Arthur nodded grimly. Oh, I absolutely think this little cruise adventure is a convenient cover for a more calculated plan. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Mom and Arthur got along? They could share that big house, or better yet, a nice 2-bedroom unit at Sunset Palms. 2 elderly relatives managed with one convenient solution. The idea was so presumptuous, so manipulative, that I nearly knocked over my teacup in indignation. That's devious? Condescending? A plot worthy of a mediocre soap opera? Arthur supplied helpfully. All of the above. I stood abruptly, pacing the kitchen with restless energy. I've lived in this house for over 40 years. I have no intention of sharing it with anyone, much less a cantankerous old man. He raised an eyebrow, challenging me to deny the description. I was going to say stranger, I finished primly. Of course you were. His tone made it clear he didn't believe me for a moment. Regardless, it seems we have a common problem and potentially a common purpose. I stopped pacing. Which is? To ensure that this little matchmaking scheme fails so spectacularly that they never attempt such manipulation again. He set his teacup down with deliberate precision. The question is whether you have the imagination and fortitude for what that might entail. There was something in his tone, a hint of mischief and challenge combined, that sparked a long-dormant part of me. Before I was Margaret Walsh, respectable piano teacher and pillar of the community, I had been Maggie, who once drove from Boston to New York on a whim to see Horowitz play at Carnegie Hall, who had taught herself Portuguese one summer simply because she loved the sound of it. "What exactly did you have in mind?" I asked, returning to my seat. Arthur's smile was slow and surprisingly wicked for a man his age. "First, we need to establish the current situation. They believe they've left two helpless senior citizens to fumble through a few days together. They expect phone calls demanding explanations, perhaps some righteous indignation, followed by grudging acceptance." I nodded, following his reasoning. "So instead, we give them absolutely nothing," he finished. "No calls, no texts, complete silence for the first 24 hours. That will certainly make them nervous," I acknowledged. "But is it enough?" "Oh, that's just the opening act, my dear." Arthur leaned forward, suddenly animated in a way that erased decades from his appearance. "After the silence comes confusion, cryptic, increasingly concerning messages, references to unexpected developments that are never quite explained, the psychological torture of uncertainty." I should have been appalled at the gleeful vindictiveness in his tone. Instead, I found myself leaning forward, equally engaged. "What kind of messages?" "Everything's fine. No need to worry," he suggested, followed hours later by, "Situation under control now. Don't concern yourselves. Please don't be angry when you see the living room," I added, warming to the game. "The fire department was very understanding," Arthur countered, his eyes twinkling. A laugh escaped me, a genuine, unrestrained sound I hardly recognized as my own. How long had it been since I'd laughed like that? "You're terrible." "I prefer creatively vindictive," he corrected. "And you, Margaret Walsh, are not nearly as proper as you pretend to be." The observation should have offended me. Instead, it felt like recognition of a self I'd nearly forgotten existed. "So," Arthur said, extending his hand across the table, "are we agreed? Shall we teach our presumptuous children a lesson in respecting their elders?" I hesitated only briefly before taking his offered hand. His skin was paper-thin, but surprisingly warm, his grip firmer than I'd expected. "Agreed," I said, feeling a flutter of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years. "Though I should warn you, Mr. Caldwell." "Arthur, please." "Arthur," I amended. "I should warn you that if we're to share this house for 4 days, there are certain rules that must be observed. I run a very orderly household." He studied me for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "I would expect nothing less, and I, in turn, must warn you that I am physically incapable of leaving my breakfast dishes anywhere but the sink, never the dishwasher, and I read aloud when I come across particularly interesting passages in books. I sing along to Puccini while cooking," I countered. "Quite loudly, I'm told. I require complete silence during Jeopardy. I alphabetize my spices and will know if they're out of order." We regarded each other across the table, two immovable objects assessing the possibility of coexistence. Then Arthur smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "I believe, Margaret, that this may be the beginning of a very interesting Thanksgiving after all." Our psychological warfare began that evening, after I'd shown Arthur to the guest room and we'd sorted out the logistics of sharing a bathroom. He in the morning, me in the evening, a schedule that honored both his early rising habits and my preference for night showers. The medication mentioned in Robert's note turned out to be a simple blood pressure pill, which Arthur was perfectly capable of managing himself. "Thank you very much. I've been taking it for 15 years, he'd said dryly when I'd mentioned the reminder. "Somehow I've survived without your son's supervision until now." Now, settled in the living room with a hastily assembled dinner of cold turkey sandwiches, the irony of eating the intended Thanksgiving bird in such an unceremonious fashion wasn't lost on either of us. We crafted our first strategic communication. "The key," Arthur explained, holding my phone between his gnarled fingers, "is to say nothing while implying everything. We want them imagining the worst without giving them anything concrete to react to." I nodded, oddly exhilarated by the mischief we were orchestrating. "So, we don't mention being upset about their departure?" "Precisely. That's what they're expecting. Righteous indignation, demands for explanation. We give them something far more unsettling, pleasant acceptance followed by cryptic concern. He typed slowly, but with surprising accuracy. Hope you're enjoying the cruise. Arthur and I are getting along splendidly. No need to worry about earlier. Everything under control now. Love, Mom. Earlier? I questioned, reading over his shoulder. That's beautifully vague. They'll be wondering what happened. Exactly. He hit send with a flourish. Now we wait. We didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, my phone chimed with Robert's response. What happened earlier? Is everything okay? Arthur's smile reminded me of a chess master who'd just trapped an opponent's queen. Now we go silent for at least 2 hours. Let that question marinate. I found myself impressed by his psychological acuity, even as I questioned whether this plan wasn't unnecessarily cruel. They'll be worried. They'll be wondering, he corrected. There's a difference. And considering they abandoned us without consultation on a major holiday, I'd say a little wondering is the least they deserve. Put that way, it was hard to argue. I set the phone aside and found myself studying my unexpected co-conspirator. In the warm lamplight, Arthur Caldwell presented a picture of dignified aging, his white hair neatly combed, his cardigan free of the food stains that often betrayed elderly tremors, his posture remarkably straight, despite his years. You're staring, he observed, without looking up from the newspaper he'd retrieved from my coffee table. Do I have turkey on my face, or are you reconsidering our alliance? Neither, I admitted. I'm just trying to reconcile the Arthur Caldwell in front of me with Bethany's descriptions. He folded the paper carefully. And what precisely did my stepdaughter say about me? That you're impossible to please, set in your ways, and say whatever comes to mind without consideration for others' feelings. To my surprise, he chuckled. All fair assessments, though incomplete. Did she mention I directed the theater department at Berkeley for 30 years? Or that I speak 4 languages? Or perhaps that I make an excellent coq au vin? She did not. Curious what details one chooses to omit when constructing a narrative. He picked up a book from my side table, a biography of Glenn Gould I'd been reading before the retreat. Ah, a pianist with opinions as strong as his technique. Are you familiar with his 1955 recording of the Goldberg Variations? The question startled me. I teach it to my advanced students. The tempo is controversial, but the clarity of counterpoint is unmatched. Arthur's eyes lit with genuine interest. You're a musician? Bethany failed to mention that as well. Piano teacher for 42 years, I confirmed. Semi-retired now, but I still have a few dedicated students. Another omission from their calculus, he mused. They've matched us based on age and perceived difficulty without considering what we might actually have in common. He tapped the book thoughtfully. Do you play Bach yourself? Every morning, I admitted. The well-tempered clavier is my meditation. Would you? He hesitated, showing the first uncertainty I'd seen from him. Would you play something? It's been months since I've heard live music. The retirement community's idea of entertainment is a gentleman with a keyboard who insists on performing The Girl from Ipanema at every opportunity. The request was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Music had always been my refuge, my clearest form of communication. Without answering, I moved to the baby grand in the corner of my living room, my most treasured possession, purchased with my first year's teaching earnings and maintained meticulously through decades. I settled on the bench, took a moment to center myself, then began the prelude in C major from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. The familiar arpeggios flowed from my fingers, filling my living room with Bach's mathematical perfection. I closed my eyes, letting muscle memory guide me through the piece I'd played thousands of times. When I finished and opened my eyes, I found Arthur watching me with an expression of profound appreciation. You play beautifully, he said simply. With precision, but not at the expense of musicality. Rare in my experience. The compliment, delivered without hyperbole or unnecessary elaboration, affected me more than flowery praise would have. Thank you. Would you play something else, he asked? Something less structured, perhaps? Chopin? I considered for a moment, then nodded. I think the situation calls for Debussy, actually. Reflets dans l'eau. As the impressionistic harmonies filled the room, I found myself playing for Arthur with the same focus I usually reserved for recitals. There was something in his listening, an attentiveness, a genuine engagement that demanded reciprocal respect. When the final notes faded, a comfortable silence settled between us. The chime of my phone broke the moment. Robert again. Mom? What do you mean, everything under control now? What happened? Please call when you get this. Arthur glanced at the clock. Only 90 minutes. He broke sooner than I anticipated. He's always been anxious by nature, I explained, feeling a twinge of maternal guilt. Perhaps we should stay the course, Arthur finished firmly. Remember why we're doing this. They treated us like interchangeable elderly inconveniences to be managed and manipulated. A few hours of uncertainty is a small price for them to pay. Put that way, my resolve strengthened. I typed a new message. No need to worry, dear. Arthur was tremendously helpful. His theater experience came in quite handy. Enjoying a lovely evening now. Signal spotty here too. Must be the weather. Arthur read it and nodded approvingly. Excellent. The reference to my theater experience suggests some kind of performance or staging was required, while tremendously helpful implies a situation needed assistance. Masterfully vague. The spotty signal excuse gives us reason not to answer calls, I added, though I borrowed that from their own playbook, which feels a bit unoriginal. In psychological warfare, efficacy trumps originality. Arthur stifled a yawn. I believe I'll retire for the evening. Tomorrow we escalate. As I prepared for bed later that night, I found myself reflecting on the strange turn my Thanksgiving had taken. Instead of the predictable family dinner with its familiar tensions and performative gratitude, I was engaged in an elaborate deception with a man I'd known less than 8 hours. Stranger still was how energized I felt by the enterprise. When was the last time I'd felt this engaged, this mentally stimulated? My life had settled into such comfortable routines that I'd stopped noticing their limitations, teaching the same pieces to different students, attending the same community events with the same acquaintances, preparing holiday meals that followed identical patterns year after year. Arthur Caldwell, with his acerbic wit and theatrical scheming, had introduced an unexpected variable into my carefully ordered existence. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized I was actually looking forward to tomorrow's developments in our little drama. A feeling so unfamiliar, it took me a moment to recognize it as anticipation. Whatever our children had intended in throwing us together, I doubted very much it was this particular alliance. The thought brought a smile to my face as I finally surrendered to sleep. The fire department was very understanding about the whole situation. I looked up from my coffee to find Arthur standing in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in pressed slacks and a cardigan despite the early hour. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd clearly shaved with meticulous care. Whatever his physical limitations, he evidently maintained exacting standards for his appearance. "Excuse me?" I questioned, still foggy from a night of unusually vivid dreams. "Our next message," he clarified, moving to the coffee pot with careful steps. I thought we might escalate to implied property damage. The fire department comment should send them into a proper panic. I checked the clock. 7:15 a.m. "You've been planning psychological warfare since dawn, I see." Insomnia has its uses. He poured coffee with a steady hand, then joined me at the kitchen table. "I've also taken the liberty of silencing your phone. 3 missed calls and 7 text messages since 6 a.m. Your son is quite persistent." "Robert has always been a worrier," I acknowledged, feeling another twinge of guilt. Even as a child, he needed constant reassurance. "And you've provided it faithfully, I imagine." There was no judgment in Arthur's tone, merely observation, creating a pattern that continues into his adulthood, where he expects you to alleviate his anxiety while feeling perfectly comfortable creating anxiety for you. The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. How many times had I rearranged my schedule to accommodate Robert's concerns? How often had I prioritized his comfort over my own convenience? "They're on a cruise ship," I reminded both of us. "How much damage could our messages really do? They're supposed to be enjoying themselves." "Precisely the point," Arthur replied, sipping his coffee with evident appreciation. "Excellent brew, by the way. Their enjoyment comes at the expense of our autonomy. A little disruption seems a fair exchange." He had a point. I retrieved my phone and reviewed the mounting evidence of Robert's concern. "Mom, what's going on? What do you mean Arthur's theater experience was helpful? Are you getting these messages? Please call when you can." "Mom, seriously, we're worried. What happened that needed to be under control? Bethany thinks you might have had a break-in. Is that what happened? We're trying to get the ship's satellite phone. We'll call when we can." "They're spiraling quite nicely," Arthur observed, reading over my shoulder. "The break-in theory is particularly inspired. I wouldn't have thought of that." "We're being terrible," I said, though without much conviction. "We're being instructive," he corrected. "Now, About that fire department message, I hesitated, then typed, "Good morning from a beautiful Vermont day. No need for satellite calls. Everything's fine now." The fire department was very understanding, and Arthur's quick thinking prevented any major damage. "You raised such thoughtful concerns about my curtains last visit, and now you'll get those new ones you wanted. Enjoy your cruise. The curtain detail is inspired," Arthur said approvingly as I showed him the message. Specific enough to be credible, yet completely mundane compared to the fire department reference. The emotional whiplash is exquisite. "I'm discovering a vindictive streak I didn't know I possessed," I admitted, pressing send before I could reconsider. "Not vindictive," Arthur corrected. "Self-advocating. There's a difference." He glanced around my kitchen with its well-organized cabinets and gleaming countertops. "Now I believe breakfast is in order. Do you have eggs? I make an excellent omelet. You cook?" I couldn't keep the surprise from my voice. "I've lived alone for 20 years, Margaret. Contrary to popular belief, elderly men don't immediately lose all basic life skills upon their wives' passing." He began opening cabinets with the confidence of someone at home in any kitchen. "Clara, my wife, was an excellent cook, but she insisted I learn the fundamentals. Art, she'd say. If you can direct King Lear, you can manage a decent bechamel." The mental image of this formal, somewhat intimidating man being gently chided by his wife made me smile. "The eggs are in the door of the refrigerator, cheese in the drawer beneath the vegetables." As Arthur prepared breakfast with surprising dexterity, I found myself wondering what else I'd misjudged about him. How much of my initial resentment had been based on genuine grievance, and how much on the same age-related assumptions I deplored in my own family. "You're doing it again," Arthur noted without turning from the stove, staring and thinking too loudly. "I don't know what you mean," I protested. "You have very expressive eyebrows, Margaret. They practically semaphore your thoughts across the room." He expertly folded the omelet with a flick of his wrist. "Right now they're saying, I've misjudged this strange old man and am reconsidering my assumptions." I laughed despite myself. "Are you always this perceptive, or am I particularly transparent?" "Both, I suspect." He slid a perfectly executed omelet onto a plate and presented it with a small flourish. "Breakfast is served." The omelet was indeed excellent, light, flavorful, with herbs I didn't recall purchasing. As we ate, I found myself sharing stories of past Thanksgivings, the year Robert had attempted to deep fry a turkey in the garage, the time Bethany's first attempt at pumpkin pie had resulted in an impromptu fire drill. "They weren't always like this," I found myself explaining, though Arthur had asked for no justification. "So, managing. Robert used to call just to chat, not to check whether I'd remembered to change the furnace filter or schedule a doctor's appointment. The shift usually comes gradually," Arthur observed. "A concerned question here, an unnecessary reminder there. By the time you recognize the pattern, the parent-child dynamic has inverted." "When did it happen for you?" I asked. A shadow crossed his expressive face. "With Clara's illness, pancreatic cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to, well," he cleared his throat. "Bethany flew in exactly twice, once when her mother was diagnosed, once for the funeral. In between, she managed everything by phone, including my transition to appropriate care." The quotation marks were audible in his tone. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "About Clara, and Bethany's response." He waved away the sympathy with a gesture that didn't quite disguise its impact. "Ancient history. 3 years now, though apparently long enough for Bethany to determine I need proper supervision, despite living independently quite successfully." Before I could respond, my phone chimed with an incoming video call request. Robert, using the ship's Wi-Fi or satellite system. I showed Arthur the screen. "Shall we answer and end their misery?" I asked. "Not yet," he decided after a moment's consideration. "Decline with a message that you're helping the insurance adjuster right now and will call later." I did as suggested, then set the phone aside. "They'll be beside themselves by now." "Good," Arthur said firmly. "Let them experience a fraction of the helplessness they imposed on us. Now what shall we do with our day? I assume you had plans beyond psychological torment?" The question caught me off guard. What would I normally do on the day after Thanksgiving? Practice piano, certainly. Perhaps read. Call a few friends to exchange holiday stories. None of it seemed particularly compelling in the face of our current conspiracy. "Actually," I said, making a spontaneous decision, "I think we should redecorate. Arthur's bushy eyebrows rose in question. If we're claiming fire damage required new curtains, we should follow through, I explained, warming to the idea. I've disliked those living room drapes for years. Too formal, too heavy. And while we're at it, perhaps the furniture arrangement could use reconsideration as well. Theatrical verisimilitude. Arthur nodded approvingly. I like your commitment to the role, Margaret. Not just that, I admitted. I've been considering changes for some time, but inertia is a powerful force. This seems like the perfect opportunity. A home improvement project with a reluctant senior citizen you've known for less than 24 hours, Arthur mused. I can see no possible downside to this plan. Despite his dry tone, I detected genuine amusement rather than offense. If we're to convince them we've bonded during their absence, we should have something to show for it, I pointed out reasonably. Besides, you have theater experience. Surely you've designed a set or two in your time. Designed, directed, occasionally dismantled in fits of artistic temperament, he confirmed with a faint smile. Very well, Margaret. Let's redecorate. Though I should warn you, I have strong opinions about textile patterns. I would expect nothing less, I replied, surprised by my own enthusiasm for the project. When was the last time I'd made a spontaneous decision to change anything in my carefully maintained home? We'll need to go shopping. There's a fabric store in town that should have suitable options. Arthur's expression turned hesitant. Shopping might be challenging. My mobility isn't what it once was. He tapped his cane with a self-deprecating gesture. Stairs and extended walking are particularly troublesome. It was the first acknowledgement of physical limitation he'd made, and I appreciated both his honesty and his evident discomfort with admitting vulnerability. We'll take my car, I said matter-of-factly. The fabric store has a ramp and wide aisles, and we can have lunch at Gibson's. They have excellent soup and a table by the window that's easy to access. The relief in his eyes was quickly masked by his usual dry humor. Planning my geriatric needs already? You've missed your calling as a nurse. Not at all, I replied evenly. I'm simply being practical. And selfish. I happen to want soup at Gibson's, and your company would make the expedition more interesting. He studied me for a moment, then nodded with surprising formality. In that case, Margaret, I accept your invitation, though I insist on buying lunch, given your gracious hospitality. Agreed, I said, extending my hand as if sealing a business deal. Though I should warn you, I have strong opinions about window treatments. I would expect nothing less, he echoed, his handshake firm despite his gnarled fingers. As we cleared breakfast dishes together, him washing, me drying in a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural, my phone buzzed again with another frantic text from Robert. Mom? Insurance adjuster? What happened? We're trying to get off at the next port if something's seriously wrong. Arthur glanced at the message and smiled that mischievous smile that transformed his scholarly appearance into something almost impish. Perfect, he pronounced. The next phase of our plan is proceeding exactly on schedule. The fabric store was exactly as I remembered. A haven of textures and patterns, tucked between a hardware store and a bakery on Main Street. What I hadn't anticipated was how different the experience would be with Arthur in tow. His observations were incisive, his opinions unvarnished, but unexpectedly insightful. That shade of burgundy has all the subtlety of a community theater Lady Macbeth, he pronounced when I held up a heavy damask. Attractive in theory, overwhelming in practice. And what would you suggest, Professor Caldwell? I asked, amused rather than offended by his candor. He moved along the aisle, cane tapping thoughtfully against the floor, before stopping at a display of lighter fabrics. This, he said, indicating a steel blue linen with a subtle herringbone texture. It has character without dominating the room, and it would complement that Aubusson rug in your living room rather than competing with it. I examined his selection, surprised by both his memory for detail, he'd noticed my rug, and his aesthetic judgment. The blue was indeed perfect, sophisticated without being stuffy, substantial without being heavy. Not at all what I'd have chosen for myself, yet somehow exactly right for the space. You have a good eye, I acknowledged, adding the fabric to our growing selection. I designed sets for 4 decades, he reminded me. Fabric can make or break a production's entire aesthetic. By the time we'd finished our selections, we had materials for not just living room curtains, but also new throw pillows and a runner for my entry hall. The total was more than I'd planned to spend, but the prospect of refreshing rooms I'd left unchanged for nearly a decade was unexpectedly exhilarating. Lunch? I suggested as we loaded our purchases into my car. Gibson's is just down the block. Arthur nodded, though I noticed he leaned more heavily on his cane than he had earlier. Our shopping expedition had clearly taxed his stamina, though he made no complaint. Another assumption challenged, far from being a burden. He seemed determined to minimize his limitations, perhaps to a fault. Gibson's was busy with post-Thanksgiving shoppers, but Maureen, the owner, spotted us immediately. "Margaret," she called, weaving through tables to greet us. "We missed you yesterday. The retreat went well?" "Very centering," I replied, accepting her quick hug. "Maureen, this is Arthur Caldwell, a family friend, visiting for the holiday weekend." Arthur extended his hand with old-world courtesy. "A pleasure, Maureen. Margaret promises your soup is unparalleled in 3 counties. Charmer!" Maureen laughed, clearly delighted. "For that, I'll give you the window table and throw in dessert. Follow me." As she led us to a sun-drenched table overlooking the town square, I caught Arthur's subtle wink. He'd deployed his considerable charisma strategically, securing us prime seating without any reference to his mobility needs. Clever man. "Family friend?" he questioned after Maureen left with our orders. "An interesting choice of descriptor for your reluctant houseguest. Would you have preferred the stranger my children abandoned with me for Thanksgiving?" I countered. Accurate, if unwieldy for casual introductions. His eyes crinkled with amusement. Though we've progressed beyond strangers at this point, I think. Reluctant co-conspirators at minimum. "Unlikely allies," I offered. "I can accept that designation." He glanced out the window at the town square with its gazebo and ancient oak trees. "Charming town. You've lived here long?" 43 years in the same house, I confirmed. Robert was 5 when we moved from Boston. My husband James had accepted a position at the college. "The music department?" Arthur guessed. "Chemistry, actually. I was the musician in the family." A familiar pang accompanied the memory of James, not the sharp grief of early widowhood, but the gentler ache of a long, empty space. "He passed 12 years ago. Heart attack while shoveling snow." Arthur nodded, requiring no platitudes about better places or time-healing wounds. "Clara was 15 years ago," he said instead. "Seems both yesterday and several lifetimes past, depending on the day." "Exactly that," I agreed, grateful for his understanding. Our soup arrived, butternut squash with apple and sage, alongside crusty bread, still warm from the oven. We ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the simple pleasure of good food providing its own communion. "Your son," Arthur said eventually. "Does he know how capable you actually are? The accomplished musician, the woman who can coordinate a complex holiday meal while simultaneously teaching piano and maintaining a home?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course he does. He grew up with me." "Children often see their parents through the narrowest of lenses," Arthur observed, focused entirely on their role as mother or father, missing the fuller humanity beneath those titles. I considered this as I broke off another piece of bread. "Perhaps you're right. Robert was young when James died. Just finishing college, he stepped into a sort of protective role almost immediately, and never stepped out of it," Arthur surmised, "even as you demonstrated year after year that you could manage perfectly well." "It comes from a place of love," I said, feeling compelled to defend my son despite our current scheme. "Most control does, in families." Arthur's tone held no judgment, only quiet understanding. We tell ourselves we're protecting each other when we're really protecting ourselves from the fear of loss, of change, of confronting mortality. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed insistently. Another message from Robert. "Mom, we're getting off at tomorrow's port and flying home. Clearly something serious has happened. Please just tell us if you're safe." I showed Arthur the message, feeling a stab of genuine guilt. Perhaps we've taken this far enough. He studied the text thoughtfully. "The next port is likely Nassau, if it's a standard Caribbean itinerary. That means they'd be sacrificing at least 2 days of their cruise and paying exorbitant last-minute airfare." "Exactly why we should stop," I insisted. "This was meant to be a small lesson, not a ruined vacation." Arthur's expression softened. "You're right, of course. Escalation has its limits." He thought for a moment. "What if we pivot, not ending the game entirely, but redirecting it? What do you suggest? A message that alleviates their immediate panic, but maintains our narrative of unexpected developments." He considered, then dictated, "Everything is absolutely fine. No need to change your travel plans. The fire was just a small kitchen incident, completely under control. Arthur and I have been having a wonderful time redecorating and getting to know each other. Such an unexpected connection. Enjoy the rest of your cruise without worry, I typed as he spoke, then showed him the result. The quotation marks around fire are a nice touch, I noted, suggesting we're using it as a euphemism for something else entirely. And unexpected connection carries just enough ambiguity to keep them intrigued without panicking, he agreed. It shifts their anxiety from concern for safety to curiosity about our developing relationship, precisely what they hoped for, though not in the way they intended. I pressed send, then set my phone aside. You're quite strategic, Arthur Caldwell. 4 decades of academic politics teaches one to plan several moves ahead, he replied with a faint smile. Though I'll admit, this particular game is more enjoyable than faculty budget meetings. After finishing our soup and the promised dessert, a maple creme brulee that Arthur declared transcendent, we made our way back to my car. I noticed he moved more slowly now, the morning's activities clearly taking their toll on his stamina. Perhaps we should save the actual redecorating for tomorrow, I suggested as we drove home, careful to frame it as a scheduling preference rather than accommodation for his fatigue. Probably wise, he agreed, seeing through the pretense but accepting it graciously. Today's reconnaissance, tomorrow's action. Good theater requires proper pacing. Back home, I insisted Arthur rest while I prepared a light dinner. To my surprise, he didn't argue, settling in the living room with one of James's old poetry anthologies. By the time I'd assembled a simple meal of soup, reheated from my pre-retreat preparations, and fresh bread from Gibson's, he'd fallen asleep in the armchair, book open on his lap. I watched him for a moment, this proud, opinionated man who'd entered my life as an imposition and was rapidly becoming something closer to a friend. In sleep, the sharp edges of his personality softened, revealing the vulnerability he worked so hard to disguise while awake. Leaving him to rest, I moved to my piano, playing softly, Debussy's Clair de Lune, its gentle impressionism filling the house with peaceful melancholy. Tomorrow would bring more scheming, more redecorating, more unexpected alliance with this unusual man. But for now, in this quiet moment, I found myself oddly grateful for the disruption of my solitary routine. My phone buzzed with a response from Robert, a relieved but clearly confused message about being glad we were safe but wanting more details soon. I silenced it without responding. The game would continue tomorrow. Tonight was for music, for quiet, for the strange peace of shared solitude with an unexpected ally. I'm not convinced about this furniture arrangement, I said, stepping back to survey our handiwork. We'd spent the morning rearranging my living room, a task that had proven more physically demanding than anticipated. The sofa seems too dominant now. Arthur, slightly winded but triumphant, shook his head. You're seeing it with memory eyes, not fresh ones. The old arrangement prioritized the fireplace, which is lovely but unused for most of the year. This, he gestured expansively, this creates conversation spaces, invites interaction rather than parallel sitting. I considered his point, trying to view the room objectively. We'd moved my sofa perpendicular to its long-time position, floated 2 armchairs across from it, and repositioned side tables to create distinct seating areas. The piano remained in its corner, but now it felt more integrated into the room rather than sequestered in its own zone. It does feel more deliberate, I admitted, less like furniture that happened to accumulate over decades. Which is precisely what it was, Arthur noted without judgment. Most homes evolve organically rather than through intentional design. We add pieces as needed, position them for convenience, then cease to see them at all. He was right, of course. When had I last actually looked at my living room, really examined the space I moved through daily? Like so many aspects of my life, it had become invisible through familiarity, comfortable but unconsidered. The curtains are next, I declared, turning to the fabric we'd draped over a chair. Though I confess I haven't sewn anything this substantial in years. Fortunately, you have access to theatrical expertise, Arthur replied, lowering himself carefully onto the newly positioned sofa. I've constructed everything from Renaissance ball gowns to alien tentacles in my time. Curtains are well within my capabilities. I raised an eyebrow. You sew? Costume design was part of my theatrical training, though I specialized in direction and set design later. He examined the fabric with a professional eye. Do you have a sewing machine, or shall we proceed by hand? In the spare bedroom closet, I replied, still processing this new dimension of Arthur's capabilities. Though I haven't used it in ages, it may need cleaning. Let's investigate, he suggested, leveraging himself up with his cane. Unless you'd prefer to rest first? We've been at this for several hours. The consideration in his tone touched me. Despite his own obvious fatigue, he was concerned for my stamina. I'm perfectly fine, I assured him, perhaps a bit more forcefully than necessary, though coffee might be in order before we tackle another project. In the kitchen, as I prepared a fresh pot, Arthur studied the photographs magnetized to my refrigerator, snapshots of Robert's family at various ages, a few older images of James and me in younger days. You have your father's profile, he observed, indicating a faded photo from the 1970s, and you've passed it to Robert. The genetic echo is quite striking. I glanced at the image, one I'd seen so many times I hardly registered it anymore. Arthur was right. The resemblance between 3 generations was unmistakable in profile. James always said Robert was more Walsh than Sullivan. My determination, my musical ear. And what did Robert inherit from his father? The question gave me pause. His analytical mind, his patience with detail. I smiled at a sudden memory. His terrible puns. James could reduce a room to groans with his wordplay. A valuable inheritance, Arthur said seriously. My Clara was similarly inclined toward linguistic mischief. Arthur, she'd say, you put the pun in punctilious. His impression of his late wife carried such fondness that I could almost see her, a woman with twinkling eyes and a quick wit, the perfect counterbalance to Arthur's formality. You miss her, I observed, handing him a mug of coffee. Every day, he confirmed simply, though the shape of the missing changes over time, less raw, more integrated into who I've become without her. The description resonated perfectly with my own experience of grief's evolution. Yes, I said. Exactly that. We carried our coffee to the spare bedroom, where I unearthed my sewing machine from the closet. To my surprise, it was in better condition than I'd feared. A light coating of dust, but otherwise intact. Singer 301, Arthur noted approvingly. A workhorse. Clara had the same model. While I cleaned the machine, Arthur measured and marked our fabric with professional precision, using pins from my old sewing basket to create perfect seams. We worked together with surprising coordination, as if we'd done this many times before. By late afternoon, we had completed 1 set of curtains and were halfway through the second. We make an efficient team, I observed as Arthur fed fabric through the machine while I guided it. Indeed, he agreed, though I suspect our children would be shocked to witness this domestic harmony. It rather undermines their perception of us as difficult, solitary creatures. Speaking of which, I glanced at my phone. Robert has sent 3 more messages asking for details about our unexpected connection. Should we respond? Arthur's eyes twinkled with mischief. Oh, absolutely. But let's give them something specific, yet ambiguous. Really make them wonder. I considered for a moment, then typed, so lovely to hear from you. Arthur and I have been quite busy, completely rearranging the living room and sewing new curtains. You wouldn't recognize the place. We discovered we share a passion for Bach and Debussy. Arthur plays the most challenging Scrabble game I've had in years, though I beat him soundly last night. No need to check in so frequently. We're having a marvelous time. Kiss the children for me. Arthur read it over my shoulder and nodded approvingly. The casual mention of spending the evening playing Scrabble is inspired, suggests comfortable domesticity without overt romantic overtones. We didn't actually play Scrabble, I pointed out. A minor detail. We certainly could have. He glanced at the antique clock on my bedside table, though perhaps we should, to maintain narrative consistency. I am, in fact, quite formidable at word games. Is that a challenge, Professor Caldwell? I asked, surprised by my own playfulness. Merely an observation, Mrs. Walsh, he replied with mock formality, though if you're proposing a contest, I would be remiss in declining. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, we paused our sewing to set up the Scrabble board in the kitchen. I prepared a simple dinner, a quiche I'd had in the freezer, reheated with a fresh salad, while Arthur arranged the board and tiles with methodical precision. House rules? He inquired as we settled at the table. Standard dictionary words only, no proper nouns, I replied, serving the quiche. and no deliberate blocking just to be difficult. "Ah, you've played with strategists before," he observed, accepting a plate with a nod of thanks. I promised to focus on word construction rather than defensive play. The game that followed was the most intellectually stimulating Scrabble match I'd played in years. Arthur's vocabulary was extraordinary, his strategy subtle but effective. I found myself drawing on linguistic knowledge I hadn't accessed since my college days, when James and I would play marathon games during snowbound weekends. "Quixotic, on a triple word score," Arthur announced, placing his tiles with flourish. "That's 72 points, I believe." I groaned in appreciation. "Impressive, though you've left an opening for—" I laid down my tiles to form Byzantine, connecting to his X and extending to a double word score. 57 points, I calculated, unable to keep the satisfaction from my voice. "Well played," he acknowledged, studying the board with genuine respect. "You're a more formidable opponent than anticipated." "You assumed I'd be an easy mark?" I challenged, though without genuine offense. "Not at all. I simply didn't expect such strategic aggression from a piano teacher. Classical musicians are among the most competitive people on earth," I informed him. "You should see the psychological warfare at conservatory auditions." He laughed, a rich, unguarded sound I hadn't heard from him before. "A fair point. Clara always said the difference between a symphony orchestra and a pack of wolves was that wolves recognize when their prey is dead." The evening passed in pleasant competition, our game interspersed with increasingly comfortable conversation. I found myself sharing stories I hadn't recalled in years, anecdotes about James, about my early career struggles, about Robert's childhood. Arthur reciprocated with tales of theatrical disasters averted, academic politics navigated, and his own parenting missteps with his 2 sons, both now living on the West Coast. "They call dutifully on holidays," he explained when I asked about their absence during his recent health struggles. "Send appropriate gifts on birthdays. But distance, both geographical and emotional, has a way of calcifying into permanence." The undercurrent of loneliness in his matter-of-fact description resonated deeply. How different was my relationship with Robert, really? Physical proximity didn't prevent emotional distance. When our game finally concluded, Arthur winning by a mere 12 points, a margin small enough to demand a rematch the following evening, we cleared the board in companionable silence. "Thank you," Arthur said unexpectedly as I placed the game box back on its shelf. "For what? Allowing you to trounce me at Scrabble?" "For today," he clarified, his tone uncharacteristically earnest. "For the sewing, and the rearranging, and this game. For treating me as a person with something to contribute, not merely an elderly inconvenience to be managed." The simple gratitude caught me off guard. "You've been far from inconvenient," I said honestly. "In fact, I've rather enjoyed having company, even company that arrived under such manipulative circumstances." His smile held a hint of his usual wryness, but also genuine warmth. "Perhaps we should send our children a thank you note for their matchmaking efforts after all. Not for the reasons they intended, but for the surprising friendship they inadvertently facilitated." "Friendship," I echoed, testing the word. "Yes, I believe that's what this is becoming." A notification chimed on my phone. Another message from Robert. This one including a photo of the family on the cruise ship, their smiles slightly strained with the effort of appearing carefree, while clearly still concerned about the situation at home. "They look miserable," Arthur observed, glancing at the image, conscience weighing on their Caribbean paradise. "Good," I replied, surprising myself with the firmness of my tone. "Perhaps it will make them think twice before making decisions for us without consultation in the future." Arthur raised an imaginary glass in salute. "To consequences, may they be educational for all involved." I mimicked his gesture with my water glass. "And to unexpected alliances, may they continue to surprise us." Sunday morning dawned with a crystalline clarity unique to late autumn in Vermont, the air sharp with impending winter, but the sunlight still carrying echoes of fading warmth. I woke earlier than usual, my mind already cycling through the day's potential activities before my feet touched the floor. This anticipation, this subtle eagerness to begin the day, felt unfamiliar after months of mornings that had blurred into sameness. 3 days with Arthur Caldwell had somehow disrupted patterns I hadn't even recognized as stagnant. Wrapping my robe around myself, I padded quietly downstairs, expecting to find the kitchen empty at this early hour. Instead, Arthur stood at the counter, methodically slicing fruit for what appeared to be an elaborate breakfast preparation. "You're up early," I observed, moving to the coffee pot, which was already 3/4 full. "Lifelong habit," he replied without turning. "Academic schedules are unforgiving, and I found early mornings the only reliable time for uninterrupted thought. Now, despite retirement's supposed freedoms, my body refuses to acknowledge any wake-up time past 6. "Mine as well," I admitted, pouring coffee for us both, "though I usually spend the time practicing piano. The morning light in the living room is perfect for sight reading." He accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "I heard you yesterday around 5:30. Bach's Italian Concerto, if I'm not mistaken. The Presto movement. The observation surprised me. You have a good ear." "Clara was the musician in our household," he said, returning to his food preparation. "Cellist with the Berkeley Symphony for 20 years. Some knowledge was bound to seep in through proximity." Another layer revealed. This formal man with his literary references and theatrical background had spent decades immersed in classical music through his wife. The recognition of shared cultural territory felt significant somehow, another thread connecting our disparate lives. "What are you making?" I asked, peering over his shoulder at the arrangement of fruits, bread, and what appeared to be some kind of batter. "Dutch baby pancake," he replied. "Clara's specialty, though mine is a pale imitation. I thought perhaps, given it's Sunday." He trailed off, suddenly seeming uncertain of his culinary initiative in my kitchen. "It looks wonderful," I assured him quickly. "I usually just have toast and coffee." "Nutritionally inadequate," he declared, his confidence returning. "Breakfast should fortify one for the day's intellectual and physical demands." "And what demands do you anticipate for today, Professor Caldwell?" I asked, amused by his professorial tone. He considered for a moment, sliding the prepared pan into the preheated oven with careful precision. "The curtains require completion, the throw pillows await their new covers, and—" he hesitated. "I thought perhaps you might be willing to play more extensively, for an appreciative audience of one." The request, delivered with uncharacteristic diffidence, touched me unexpectedly. How long had it been since anyone had specifically asked to hear me play? My students and their parents viewed my demonstrations as instructional, not performative. Robert and his family politely endured my playing during visits, their attention clearly elsewhere. "I would be happy to play for you," I said, meaning it. "Though I should warn you, my repertoire has grown somewhat limited with age. Arthritis makes Liszt and Rachmaninoff increasingly challenging." "All musicians edit their repertoire with time," Arthur replied matter-of-factly. "The wise ones adapt rather than abandon." Clara switched to Baroque works in her later years, fewer extended positions, more opportunity for expressiveness within technical constraints. Again, that surprising knowledge, delivered without condescension or pity, just practical understanding from someone familiar with a musician's physical realities. "You continue to surprise me, Arthur Caldwell," I admitted, setting the table as he prepared a simple fruit compote for the pancake. "Good," he replied with a small smile. "Predictability is the enemy of engagement. Clara used to say she stayed with me for 43 years because she never knew what I might say next. James was the opposite," I found myself sharing. "Completely reliable, entirely predictable. I always knew exactly how he would respond to any given situation. It was comforting." "Different personalities require different companions," Arthur observed. "The theatrical temperament benefits from a stabilizing influence. Perhaps the musical one thrives with dependable rhythms." The insight was unexpectedly perceptive. Before I could respond, the oven timer chimed. Arthur extracted a perfectly puffed pancake, its edges golden and crisp, its center creating a perfect hollow for the fruit compote he'd prepared. "Impressive," I acknowledged, as he served our plates with a flourish worthy of a fine restaurant. "You've been holding out on me, Arthur. Yesterday's omelet was no fluke. Culinary skills developed from necessity," he explained, joining me at the table. "After Clara died, I could either learn to cook properly or resign myself to an endless succession of mediocre restaurant meals and sympathy casseroles." We ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the pancake indeed delicious, light, slightly custardy in the center, with the fruit compote providing perfect tart contrast to its sweetness. "Our children would be shocked," I observed, accepting a second helping, "to see us sharing breakfast like this, comfortable in each other's company. It rather undermines their perception of us as difficult and demanding, doesn't it?" Perhaps that's the most valuable lesson in this situation, Arthur replied thoughtfully. That their parents are full human beings, not merely aging problems to be managed or character traits to be tolerated. After breakfast, we returned to our sewing project, completing the second set of curtains by mid-morning. Arthur insisted on hanging them immediately, though the effort clearly taxed his strength. The result was transformative. The heavy damask that had darkened my living room for 15 years, replaced by the luminous blue linen that somehow made the entire space feel both more elegant and more welcoming. It's as if the room can breathe again, I said, stepping back to admire our work. Precisely the effect I was aiming for, Arthur agreed, settling carefully into an armchair. Now, I believe you promised me a private recital? I moved to the piano, suddenly feeling a flutter of performance anxiety I hadn't experienced in years. What should I play for this man who knew enough about music to appreciate it deeply but wasn't a musician himself? After a moment's consideration, I began with Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major, romantic without being showy, technically manageable for my aging hands, but still offering emotional depth. As the music filled the room, I found myself playing not as a teacher demonstrating technique, nor as a solitary practitioner maintaining skills, but as a genuine performer communicating through the music. Arthur listened with complete attention, his eyes sometimes closed, sometimes watching my hands, but always fully engaged with the sound. When I finished the Schubert, I moved without pause into Debussy's Reflets dans l'eau, then a Bach prelude, then Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Each piece flowed naturally into the next, creating a program I hadn't consciously planned, but that emerged from some deeper musical intuition. Nearly 40 minutes later, I finally paused, surprised by how much I'd played without tiring. Arthur remained silent for a moment, as if allowing the final notes to fully dissipate before speaking. "Thank you," he said simply. "That was extraordinary." "You're very kind," I demurred automatically. "Not kind, accurate." His tone brooked no argument. "You play with remarkable sensitivity. Technical proficiency, yes, but more importantly, genuine interpretive intelligence. One understands why you've been a successful teacher all these years." The specific, knowledgeable praise affected me more deeply than effusive compliments would have. "You know more about music than you let on," I observed. 43 years with Clara, he reminded me. Countless rehearsals, performances, post-concert analyses. Music was our common language, though I participated as listener rather than creator. The most important participant in any performance, I noted. Without the listener, music is merely vibrating air. A notification from my phone interrupted our conversation. Another message from Robert. "Getting worried again, Mom. You're not responding much. Is everything really okay?" Also, Bethany tried calling her stepfather's nursing home, and they said he was on leave. What's going on? I showed Arthur the message, noting the escalating concern. "They're not enjoying their cruise much, it seems." "Good," Arthur said with a hint of satisfaction. "Though I'm troubled by Bethany's characterization of my living situation. I'm in a private retirement community, not a nursing home. Independent, living with optional services. Another example of them recasting our lives to fit their narrative," I observed, composing a reply. "Everything is absolutely wonderful. Arthur has made Dutch baby pancakes for breakfast, and I've been playing piano all morning. We finished the curtains and they're transformed the living room. Pictures attached. Don't worry about calling Arthur's residence. We've extended his stay through Tuesday. We're having such a lovely time. Might take a drive to the lake this afternoon if weather permits." I added a photo of our newly curtained and rearranged living room, careful to include enough of the change to be noticeable without revealing the full extent of our transformation. "Tuesday?" Arthur questioned, reading over my shoulder. "That's a day beyond their scheduled return." "A small escalation," I explained, suggesting we're so comfortable together that we've extended our arrangement beyond their imposed timeline. His smile held genuine admiration. "Margaret Walsh, you have a devious streak I find utterly delightful." "High praise from the mastermind of our psychological operation," I replied, feeling an unexpected flush of pleasure at his approval. "Speaking of operations," Arthur said, glancing out the window at the clear autumn day, "were you serious about that drive to the lake? It's been years since I've seen Lake Champlain, and the weather seems ideal." The suggestion caught me by surprise. I hadn't actually planned an outing, had merely mentioned it to enhance our narrative of comfortable companionship. But looking at the golden sunlight streaming through our new curtains, The idea suddenly appealed tremendously. I'd love to, I decided impulsively. The foliage along the shore drive should be spectacular this time of year. Arthur's face lit with genuine pleasure. Excellent. Though I should warn you, I make a terrible passenger. Clara said I have an unfortunate tendency to provide unsolicited navigational advice. I'm sure I've heard worse from 40 years of backseat driving piano parents, I assured him, already mentally planning our route. Pack a sweater. The wind off the lake can be brisk this time of year. As I gathered my own things for our impromptu adventure, I realized how organically we'd moved from reluctant housemates to willing companions in just 3 days. Whatever our children had intended in throwing us together, they couldn't have anticipated this easy alliance, this unexpected compatibility between two supposedly difficult personalities. The thought brought a smile to my face as I reached for my car keys. Perhaps the true revenge wouldn't be making them worry, but rather showing them just how wrong they'd been about us all along. Lake Champlain stretched before us like liquid silver, its vast surface reflecting the clear autumn sky with mirror-like perfection. We'd driven the scenic route, winding through forests ablaze with late-season color, Arthur proving true to his word about being an observant passenger. His commentary, however, had been less navigational criticism and more informed appreciation of the landscape, identifying distant mountain peaks, remarking on particularly spectacular maple trees, sharing historical anecdotes about the towns we passed through. The British actually fired on that harbor during the War of 1812. He'd noted, as we passed a small bayside village, a minor skirmish largely forgotten by history books, but still commemorated by local historical societies. Now we sat on a lakeside bench at Burlington Bay Park, bundled against the brisk wind that occasionally ruffled the lake's surface. I'd packed a small thermos of hot tea and some leftover maple cookies from my pre-retreat baking, which we shared as sailboats skimmed across the distance like white birds. I'd forgotten how magnificent this view is, Arthur said, his gaze fixed on the distant Adirondacks rising beyond the lake. Clara and I came here once, during my visiting semester at Middlebury, 1987, I believe. We rented a small sailboat, grossly overestimated our maritime abilities, and had to be rescued by an amused park ranger when the wind died unexpectedly. I smiled at the image. A younger Arthur, less physically limited but likely just as opinionated, adrift with his musician wife. James was terrified of water, I offered in return. He could swim, but natural bodies of water filled him with inexplicable dread. We compromised by picnicking at lookout points like this one, close enough to appreciate the lake's beauty, far enough to avoid its dangers. A sensible arrangement, Arthur nodded. Successful marriages require such accommodations. Yes, I agreed, remembering how easily James and I had navigated our differences, how we'd built a life that honored both his need for routine and my occasional impulsive artistic requirements. Though I sometimes wonder if I've accommodated too much since his death. Arthur turned slightly to face me, his expression questioning. With Robert, I mean, I clarified, allowing his concerns to shape my choices more than perhaps they should, accepting his definition of what's appropriate for someone my age. The gradual erosion of autonomy, Arthur said with understanding, nearly imperceptible until suddenly one finds oneself being managed rather than consulted. Exactly that, I confirmed, grateful for his precise articulation of what I'd been feeling but struggling to name. And I've allowed it, which is perhaps most frustrating of all. Self-recrimination serves little purpose, Arthur observed mildly. Recognizing the pattern is what matters, adjusting course while there's still time to chart a new direction. His words carried no judgment, only practical wisdom. I found myself wondering what kind of professor he had been, likely demanding but fair, challenging his students to greater clarity of thought without diminishing their efforts. What will you tell them? I asked after a comfortable silence. When they return and discover our little deception? Arthur considered the question, watching a pair of kayakers navigate the shoreline below us. The truth, I think, that we objected to being manipulated, to decisions made on our behalf without consultation, that we chose to make a point through somewhat theatrical means. And about us? The question emerged before I'd fully formulated it in my own mind. That we discovered unexpected compatibility, he replied carefully. That adversity, Even artificially imposed adversity can forge connections between unlikely allies. Friendship, I supplied, naming what had developed between us over these strange, transformative days. Indeed, he smiled, the expression warming his scholarly features. An unexpected gift from a thoroughly ill-conceived matchmaking scheme. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the play of light on water, the distant mountains standing sentinel over the vast lake. Eventually, noting Arthur's slight shiver despite his heavy sweater, I suggested we continue our drive to a small cafe I knew in Charlotte that offered excellent soup and a view of the lake from its heated indoor porch. As we walked carefully back to my car, Arthur leaning more heavily on his cane than he had earlier, I found myself automatically adjusting my pace to match his, offering my arm on a particularly uneven section of path, not with the hovering concern of someone managing a fragile elder, but with the natural consideration of one friend for another. "You know," Arthur said as we settled back into the car, "I believe this is the first time since Clara's death that I've spent a day out without being hyper-aware of my limitations, without feeling like a burden or an inconvenience to whoever has accompanied me." The simple admission touched me deeply. "I can't imagine anyone finding your company burdensome," I said honestly. "Then you have a limited imagination indeed," he replied, though his tone held no bitterness, merely wry self-awareness. "I am, as Bethany has undoubtedly informed you, difficult and set in my ways. These qualities do not make me an ideal companion for excursions that require patience and accommodation. Perhaps you've simply been paired with impatient and inflexible companions," I suggested, navigating back toward the scenic route that would take us to Charlotte. Arthur's laugh was unexpected, a genuine sound of surprised delight. "Clara would have adored you," he declared. "She always accused me of selecting the wrong metrics for evaluating interpersonal dynamics. A fancy way of saying you misjudge people?" I teased gently. "Precisely that." His admission held no defensiveness, only self-deprecating humor. A lifelong habit I've struggled to correct. The cafe in Charlotte was exactly as I'd remembered, a converted Victorian house with a glassed-in porch offering panoramic views of the lake. We were seated at a prime corner table, served excellent butternut squash soup and fresh bread, and left in peace to enjoy both the food and the spectacular vista. "We should document this excursion," Arthur suggested as we finished our meal. "For our ongoing narrative." I understood immediately, retrieving my phone to take a selfie of us against the backdrop of the lake. Arthur leaned in slightly, his white hair contrasting with my silver gray, both of us wearing expressions of genuine enjoyment rather than the posed smiles of obligatory photographs. "Perfect," he pronounced, reviewing the image. "Send it with a suitably ambiguous caption." I composed a new message to Robert. "Wonderful day exploring the lake with Arthur. He knows so much about local history. Now enjoying soup at Charlotte Bay Cafe. No need to check in so frequently. We're having a marvelous time together. Such an unexpected connection. We've decided Arthur will stay through Tuesday, since we're enjoying each other's company so much." The repeated, unexpected connection phrase should thoroughly unsettle them, Arthur noted with satisfaction, particularly combined with the extended stay reference. "You're enjoying this entirely too much," I observed, though without censure. "I haven't had this much fun since staging Ionesco's The Chairs with an actual flood in the theater basement," he admitted. "There's something uniquely satisfying about controlled chaos and its resultant revelations." As we drove home in the gathering twilight, a comfortable silence settled between us. Arthur dozed briefly, the day's activities having clearly taxed his endurance, while I navigated the darkening roads with the confidence of long familiarity. The experience felt surprisingly intimate, not in any romantic sense, but in the quiet trust of shared vulnerability. He didn't feel compelled to stay alert or engaged for my benefit. I didn't feel obligated to maintain conversation for his. Back home, we moved through the evening routine we'd somehow established in just a few days. Arthur making tea while I built a small fire in the living room fireplace, unused for months, but now somehow essential to our evening's conclusion. We settled in the newly arranged seating area, the flames casting warm light across the room, now transformed by our collaborative efforts. "Shall we check their response?" Arthur suggested, gesturing toward my phone, which I'd deliberately left untouched since sending our latest provocative message. The screen revealed multiple notifications, 3 missed calls, and a series of increasingly concerned texts from both Robert and Bethany. I selected the most recent. Mom, seriously, what's going on? Unexpected connection? Extended stay? You barely know Arthur. And Bethany says he can be very difficult. We're worried about you. Please call as soon as you can. I showed Arthur the message, noting his raised eyebrow at the very difficult reference. They're genuinely concerned now, I observed, feeling another flicker of guilt. Perhaps we've taken this far enough. Perhaps, Arthur conceded. Though I'd suggest one final strategic communication before we ease their minds. What did you have in mind? His smile held that now familiar hint of mischief. Something to suggest our connection has progressed beyond mere friendship, without explicitly stating anything of the sort. Let them draw their own conclusions, which will undoubtedly be dramatic and entirely wrong. I considered his suggestion. Our little scheme had certainly made its point, but there was something undeniably satisfying about this final twist. Very well, Professor Caldwell. What do you propose? Arthur dictated, his theatrical timing perfect. Robert, dear, no need for concern. Arthur and I have indeed discovered how compatible we are, despite our brief acquaintance. Some connections simply defy conventional timelines. We're discussing potential arrangements for after your return. This house does have plenty of room, after all. We'll explain everything when you're back. Sleep well, I typed as he spoke, then showed him the result. Deliciously ambiguous, I approved, suggesting potential living arrangements without actually claiming anything specific. The strategic deployment of implications, Arthur nodded, a specialty of both theater and academia. As I pressed send, setting our final act in motion, I realized with sudden clarity how much I would miss this, the conspiracy, the shared humor, the intellectual stimulation of Arthur's company, when our children returned and our brief alliance reached its inevitable conclusion. The recognition must have shown on my face, for Arthur's expression softened into something gentler than his usual sardonic mask. For what it's worth, Margaret, he said quietly, these have been the most engaging days I've experienced in years. For me as well, I admitted, quite an unexpected result from an unwelcome imposition. Outside, the first snow flurries of the season began to fall, delicate crystalline messengers of winter swirling against the darkened windows. Inside, the fire crackled in friendly counterpoint to our conversation as we began another game of Scrabble. This one less competitive, more an excuse to prolong the evening, to extend our companionship before the inevitable return to our separate lives. Monday dawned with a light dusting of snow, transforming my garden into a monochromatic etching, the world reimagined in white and black and infinite shades of gray. I found Arthur already in the kitchen, his morning routine now established, preparing what had become our customary breakfast. Our final full day of imposed companionship, he observed, handing me a cup of coffee prepared exactly as I preferred. How shall we mark the occasion? I sipped the coffee, considering. We've redecorated the living room, completed the curtains, played Scrabble, and toured the lake. What's left for our fabricated romantic narrative? Perhaps something appropriately domestic, yet subtly suggestive of deeper connection. Arthur mused, his expression thoughtful as he expertly flipped a perfect omelet. A shared creative project, perhaps? I do have James's old camera equipment in the attic, I offered, the idea taking shape as I spoke. He was quite the photography enthusiast. I've thought about organizing his collection for years, but never found the motivation. Perfect, Arthur declared. Sorting through personal history together suggests intimacy without explicitly claiming it, and it provides opportunity for genuine connection through shared discovery. After breakfast, we ventured into the attic, a space I hadn't properly visited in years, accessing it only occasionally to retrieve holiday decorations or store unused household items. The stairs posed a challenge for Arthur, but he managed with careful determination, refusing my offered assistance with a polite but firm, "I may be slow, but I am still capable, thank you." The attic was surprisingly orderly, a testament to James's methodical nature. His photography equipment occupied a clear section along the back wall, boxes of prints, albums, and several cameras arranged on shelves he'd built specifically for their storage. He was serious about this, Arthur observed, examining a professional-grade Nikon with knowledgeable hands. This is excellent equipment, even by today's standards. Photography was his counterbalance to chemistry, I explained. opening a box of carefully labeled prints. The precision of science during the week, the creativity of image-making on weekends. We settled on the attic floor, cushioned by old quilts I retrieved from a cedar chest, and began exploring James's photographic legacy. The images revealed a perspective of my late husband I'd somehow forgotten. His eye for composition, his ability to capture intimate moments without sentimentality, his particular fascination with the interplay of light and shadow. "These are remarkable," Arthur said, examining a series of black and white landscapes. He had genuine talent. "Yes," I agreed, surprised by how deeply the recognition affected me. He always called it a hobby, but he approached it with the same dedication he brought to his academic work. As we sorted through decades of images, I found myself sharing stories about James, about our life together, about the trips and experiences documented in his photographs. Arthur listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite accommodation. In one box, we discovered a series of images James had taken of me, playing piano, gardening, reading by windows, unaware of the camera's presence. Seeing myself through my husband's eyes was unexpectedly moving. The obvious love in his perspective, the care with which he'd captured moments I hadn't realized were being preserved. "He saw you very clearly," Arthur observed quietly, studying a particularly striking image of me at the piano, my expression absorbed in the music, light from the window creating a natural spotlight. "Not just your physical presence, but something essential about your character." "Yes," I whispered, throat suddenly tight with emotion. "He did." Arthur set the photograph aside with unexpected gentleness. "Perhaps we should take a break. This is becoming more affecting than our psychological warfare operation anticipated." His perception and consideration touched me. "Thank you," I said simply. We moved downstairs for lunch, a simple affair of soup and bread, and I found myself contemplating the strange intimacy that had developed between us in just 4 days. This man who had arrived as an unwelcome imposition had somehow become a trusted confidant, someone with whom I could share memories of James without the awkward sympathy or impatient tolerance such reminiscences often inspired in others. "You're thinking too loudly again," Arthur noted, his tone gently teasing. "Just reflecting on how quickly circumstances can change," I replied. 4 days ago, I was dreading your presence. Now I find myself—" I hesitated, uncertain how to articulate the shift. "Tolerating me admirably?" he suggested with a hint of his dry humor. "Enjoying your company," I corrected firmly, and rather dreading its conclusion. The admission hung between us, more vulnerable than I'd intended. Arthur's expression softened, the usual sardonic mask slipping to reveal something gentler beneath. "The sentiment is entirely mutual," he said quietly. "These days have been unexpectedly significant." Before I could respond, my phone rang. Not a text this time, but an actual call from Robert. Arthur and I exchanged glances, our private moment interrupted by the very situation that had brought us together. "Should I answer?" I asked, though I already knew we must eventually face the consequences of our little scheme. "By all means," Arthur nodded, "though perhaps on speaker, so we may coordinate our performance." I accepted the call, activating the speakerphone. "Hello, Robert." "Mom." My son's voice carried equal measures of relief and concern. "Finally! We've been trying to reach you for days." "I've responded to your texts," I reminded him mildly. "Arthur and I have been quite busy." "That's exactly what we're worried about," Robert replied, his tone shifting to one I recognized all too well, the careful, overly patient voice he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "These messages about unexpected connections and extended stays. It's not like you, Mom." "Perhaps you don't know what's like me as well as you think," I suggested, catching Arthur's approving nod from across the table. "Mom, be reasonable. You've known this man for 4 days, and suddenly you're talking about him staying longer? About potential arrangements? Bethany says he can be very challenging to deal with." Arthur's eyebrows rose at this diplomatic rendering of his supposedly difficult personality. "Arthur and I understand each other perfectly," I said, enjoying the deliberate ambiguity. "Sometimes the most unexpected people prove to be the most compatible." A new voice joined the conversation. Bethany, apparently listening on another extension. "Margaret, we're just concerned. Arthur has been known to be persuasive, and he's had some health issues recently that require consideration." Arthur's expression darkened at this characterization. He gestured for permission to speak, which I granted with a nod. "Bethany," he said, his voice carrying the precise diction of his theatrical training, "while I appreciate your concern, I assure you both my powers of persuasion and my health status have been grossly misrepresented. Margaret and I are both perfectly competent adults, enjoying each other's company without any need for supervision or intervention." Silence greeted this pronouncement, followed by Robert's cautious, "Arthur, hello. We didn't realize you were listening." "Evidently," Arthur replied dryly, "just as you didn't realize how transparent your little scheme would be to two reasonably intelligent individuals." Another silence, this one more pronounced. I could almost see Robert and Bethany exchanging panicked glances across the cruise ship cabin. "Scheme?" Bethany attempted innocence. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you are," I interjected. "The convenient cruise, the last-minute arrangements, the obvious hope that throwing two difficult elderly relatives together might solve your perceived problems with both of us." "Mom, that's not—" Robert began. "Isn't it?" I interrupted, surprising myself with my forthright confrontation. "Be honest, Robert. This wasn't just about a cruise opportunity. This was about seeing if Arthur and I might—" "What? Become companions? Solve your elder care concerns in one convenient package?" The extended silence confirmed our suspicions more effectively than any admission could have. "We thought you might enjoy each other's company," Bethany finally offered, her tone defensive. "You're both intelligent, cultured people with similar backgrounds, and both inconveniently independent in our living arrangements," Arthur added pointedly. "Look," Robert said, his voice shifting to the reasonable tone he used in difficult negotiations, "maybe we should discuss this when we get back tomorrow, in person, when everyone's had time to process." "An excellent suggestion," I agreed, exchanging a glance with Arthur. "We have much to tell you about our time together. Just don't make any major decisions before we return, okay?" Robert's concern was palpable, even through the phone connection. "No big changes or arrangements." "We're quite capable of making our own decisions, Robert," I replied, a new firmness in my tone that seemed to surprise him into momentary silence. "But we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Safe travels." After ending the call, Arthur and I sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, the reality of our impending return to separate lives suddenly more immediate. "Well," he said finally, "it appears our little performance has had precisely the effect we intended. They're thoroughly disconcerted by the possibility that their matchmaking succeeded beyond their expectations." "Yes," I agreed, though with less satisfaction than I'd anticipated. The conversation had clarified something I'd been reluctant to acknowledge, that tomorrow would bring not just our children's return, but the conclusion of this unexpected interlude. "What happens now?" Arthur considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "We continue as planned. They arrive, we reveal our awareness of their scheme, we establish clear boundaries regarding future decision-making. And then," he left the sentence unfinished, the then hanging between us, the return to our separate lives, the end of our brief alliance. "And then," I echoed, surprised by my reluctance to articulate the conclusion we both recognized was coming. Outside, the light snow had stopped, leaving the world transformed, familiar shapes rendered new by their coating of white. Inside, a similar transformation had occurred, though less visible and more profound. 4 days of unexpected companionship had changed something fundamental in my daily existence, awakened aspects of myself I'd allowed to go dormant. The question was whether that change could, or should, extend beyond this artificial situation our children had created. Arthur met my gaze, his expression suggesting he was navigating similar thoughts. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should discuss what comes after then, while we still have privacy to do so." "Perhaps we should," I agreed, recognizing that whatever came next would be our choice, not our children's scheme, not their well-intentioned manipulation, but our own authentic decision about the unexpected connection that had developed between two supposedly difficult people thrown together by circumstance. I woke on Tuesday morning with the disorienting awareness that something significant was ending. Our 4-day adventure in psychological warfare and unexpected friendship had reached its final act. Robert and Bethany would return this evening, expecting to find either confirmation of their matchmaking success or the disaster of two difficult personalities at odds. What they would actually discover was something far more nuanced, and perhaps more unsettling to their worldview. Arthur was already in the kitchen when I descended, though he'd departed from our established routine. Instead of cooking breakfast, he sat at the table nursing a cup of coffee, a distant expression suggesting deep thought. "Good morning," I greeted him, pouring my own coffee. "You look contemplative." "Plotting our final act," he replied, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The dramatic confrontation when our children return to find their scheme uncovered." "Ah yes, the denouement," I said, settling across from him, "though I find myself less interested in their discomfort than I was 4 days ago." "As do I," he admitted. "Revenge, even of our mild variety, has lost some of its appeal." We sat in companionable silence for a moment, both aware of the conversation we'd begun yesterday but not yet concluded, the question of what came after today's revelation and return to separate lives. "About our discussion yesterday," Arthur began, setting his coffee aside with careful precision. "I've been considering what comes next, after our children's return." "As have I acknowledged. "And have you reached any conclusions?" His tone was carefully neutral, giving no indication of his own thoughts on the matter. I considered how to articulate the complex emotions that had developed over our brief acquaintance. "I've enjoyed these days more than I anticipated," I began cautiously. "Your company has been stimulating, engaging in a way my life hasn't been for some time." "High praise indeed," he noted with a hint of his dry humor, "from someone who initially viewed my presence as an imposition." "The highest," I confirmed seriously. "And I find myself reluctant to return to the solitude that preceded your arrival." Arthur's expression shifted subtly. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. "I've been thinking similarly," he admitted. "These past days have reminded me of aspects of social existence I'd forgotten I enjoyed. Conversation with someone of compatible intellect, shared meals, even the small domestic negotiations of shared space. We work well together," I observed, "despite our supposedly difficult natures. Or perhaps because of them," he suggested. "Two strong personalities who respect each other's boundaries precisely because we value our own so highly." The insight was characteristically perceptive. What might have been friction between us had instead created a balanced tension, a mutual recognition of independence that paradoxically allowed for closer connection. "So where does that leave us?" I asked directly, never having been one for excessive circumlocution. "When Robert and Bethany return expecting either conflict or romance, what do we tell them?" Arthur leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes intent. "The truth, I think, that we discovered an unexpected friendship, that we enjoyed each other's company and may wish to continue that association, on our terms rather than theirs." "Friendship," I echoed, finding the word both accurate and somehow insufficient for what had developed between us. "Yes, that seems right. With the potential for more," he added carefully, "if that's something you might consider. Eventually, without pressure or expectation." The qualification was so typically Arthur, precise, leaving room for dignified retreat if necessary, yet honest in its expression of possibility. I found myself smiling at his characteristic approach. "I might consider it," I acknowledged. "Eventually, without pressure or expectation." His answering smile held genuine warmth. "Then I believe we understand each other." "I believe we do," I agreed, feeling a sense of quiet rightness settle between us. The remainder of the day passed in preparations for our children's return. We completed the finishing touches on our redecorating project, Arthur insisting on helping me prepare a welcome home meal, despite my protests that he was a guest. "No longer merely a guest," he corrected, expertly chopping vegetables for a salad. "An ally, at minimum, perhaps a co-conspirator, possibly even a friend." "All of the above," I conceded, allowing him to take over the salad preparation while I focused on the main course. As afternoon faded toward evening, I found myself growing unexpectedly nervous. Our children's imminent return meant facing not just their reaction to our revelation, but also the reality of Arthur's departure. Despite our conversation about future possibilities, practical questions remained unanswered. How often we might see each other, whether our connection could sustain itself outside the intensity of these 4 isolated days. "They're here," Arthur announced from his position near the front window, where he'd stationed himself with deliberate theatricality. 2 cars. They must have driven separately from the airport. I joined him at the window, watching Robert's sedan pull into my driveway, followed by Bethany's SUV. They emerged looking travel-worn but alert, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity as they approached my front door. "Ready?" Arthur asked quietly. "As I'll ever be," I replied, straightening my shoulders. The doorbell rang and I moved to answer it. Arthur positioned strategically in the living room where the full impact of our redecorating efforts would be immediately visible. "Mom!" Robert exclaimed as I opened the door, embracing me with more emotion than our usual greetings carried. "You're okay." "Of course I'm okay," I replied, accepting his hug while noting Bethany hovering anxiously behind him. "Why wouldn't I be?" "Your messages," Bethany explained, following Robert into the foyer. "They were so cryptic, and then that last one about potential arrangements." Her voice trailed off as she caught sight of the transformed living room with its new curtains, rearranged furniture, and Arthur seated in what had previously been James's chair, regarding them with calm amusement. "Arthur," she greeted him cautiously, "you're still here." "As anticipated," he replied dryly, "though perhaps not in the condition you expected to find me." "What does that mean?" Robert asked, his gaze moving between us with growing suspicion. "And what happened to the living room?" "We redecorated," I explained simply. "The room needed updating, and Arthur has an excellent eye for design." "You redecorated together," Robert repeated slowly, as if processing a complex equation. "And the fire department? The insurance adjusters?" Arthur and I exchanged glances, a silent communication that didn't go unnoticed by our children. "Perhaps we should all sit down," I suggested, gesturing to the newly arranged seating area. "There's quite a bit to discuss." Once settled, Robert and Bethany perched tensely on the sofa, Arthur and I in matching armchairs opposite them. I began our carefully prepared explanation. First, there was no fire, no emergency, no crisis of any kind, I stated calmly. "Those references were deliberately misleading." "But why would you?" Robert began. "Because," Arthur interjected smoothly, "we rather quickly discerned the actual purpose behind your convenient cruise and my equally convenient placement here." Bethany's cheeks flushed. "I don't know what you're implying." "Oh, I think you do," I countered gently. "The suddenly available cruise, the last-minute arrangement, the hope that throwing two supposedly difficult elderly relatives together might solve your perceived problem of our independent living situations." Robert had the grace to look embarrassed. "Mom, it wasn't like that. We just thought that we might get along," Arthur suggested. "Form a connection that would make your lives more convenient. Perhaps even consider sharing living arrangements, solving two eldercare concerns with one efficient solution." The accuracy of our assessment was confirmed by their uncomfortable silence. "Here's what actually happened," I continued. "We immediately recognized your scheme for what it was. We were initially quite annoyed at being manipulated, at having decisions made for us without consultation. So we decided," Arthur added, "to give you a taste of your own medicine, to create sufficient anxiety and uncertainty that you might reconsider such high-handed tactics in the future." Understanding dawned on Robert's face. The cryptic messages, the references to fires and insurance, the unexpected connection. It was all a performance, Arthur confirmed, designed to unsettle you precisely as you had unsettled us with your presumptuous arrangements. That's, Bethany seemed at a loss for words. "Childish?" I suggested. "Perhaps, but effective, I think, in demonstrating how it feels to have others making decisions about your life without your input or consent." Robert leaned forward, his expression shifting from embarrassment to genuine contrition. "You're right. We should have asked, not assumed. I'm sorry, Mom. And Arthur, I apologize for putting you in this position." "Apology accepted," I said, Arthur nodding in agreement beside me. "But there's something else you should know." "What's that?" Bethany asked warily. I glanced at Arthur, who gave me a slight nod of encouragement. "While your scheme was inappropriate in its execution, it wasn't entirely misguided in its basic premise. Arthur and I have, in fact, discovered that we enjoy each other's company." "You have?" Robert couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "Indeed," Arthur confirmed. "Your mother is an exceptional pianist, a formidable Scrabble opponent, and possesses a devious streak that complements my own theatrical tendencies quite admirably. And Arthur," I added, "has proven to be thoughtful, intellectually engaging, and surprisingly domestic in his abilities. We've formed a friendship we both value and intend to continue." "Friendship," Robert repeated slowly, as if testing the word for hidden meanings. "Yes, friendship," Arthur confirmed, with the potential for further development should we both choose to explore that possibility. On our terms, in our own time, without external pressure or expectation. The carefully worded statement left our children momentarily speechless, exactly the effect we'd anticipated. So you're not... Bethany gestured vaguely, apparently unable to articulate the romantic scenario they'd either feared or hoped for. We're two adults who've discovered compatible interests and personalities, I clarified, who may choose to spend more time together in the future. Nothing more definitive than that at present. I see, Robert said, though his expression suggested continued processing. And the living arrangements you mentioned in your message? A deliberate provocation, Arthur admitted. Though we have discussed the possibility of future visits, weekend stays, perhaps even longer sojourns, eventually. But not immediate cohabitation or major life changes, I added, seeing the concern still etched on Robert's face. We're proceeding at our own pace, making our own decisions about what feels right for us, which, Arthur concluded pointedly, is precisely how it should be. Our lives, our choices, with your support welcomed, but your management neither required nor desired. The message was clear but delivered without unnecessary harshness. I watched understanding settle across our children's faces, the realization that their parents, while aging, remained competent individuals entitled to self-determination. Well, Robert said finally, I guess we deserved that lesson. You did, I agreed without rancor. But dinner is ready, and I suggest we move past recriminations to enjoy our belated Thanksgiving meal together. There is, after all, much to be thankful for. As we moved to the dining room, I caught Arthur's eye across the table, a silent communication of shared victory and genuine affection. Whatever came next would unfold according to our own timeline, our own carefully considered choices. But the connection we'd formed in these 4 unexpected days had already transformed something essential in both our lives. Our children had intended to solve a problem by throwing 2 difficult people together. Instead, they'd inadvertently created something neither they nor we could have anticipated. A genuine meeting of compatible minds, an alliance born of shared indignation that had blossomed into something with far greater potential. As I served the meal I'd prepared with Arthur's assistance, I found myself genuinely thankful for their misguided scheme after all. Sometimes it seemed the wrong reasons could lead to unexpectedly right results. To unexpected connections, Arthur proposed, raising his glass in a toast that carried layers of private meaning between us. And to making our own choices, I added, completing the sentiment. Our glasses clinked in harmony, marking not an ending but a beginning, one we would define for ourselves in our own time, on our own terms.